All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ed Kuiters. I'm from the Netherlands. Came to Japan 8 years ago, and I usually take care of the presentations for Swingby Corporation. Other than that, I run a software company around the corner. Welcome everybody. Today's topic was a little bit of a difficult one because we'd like to discuss current events and especially relations between the events to get a sense of a bigger picture. So how do things relate? How does one thing connect to another? So I thought maybe it was a good idea to start with something that is very visible, very touchable, and bring it from there in our next meetings. So without further ado, I would like to get started with something that's on everybody's mind and in the news every day, Islamic State. And take a brief look into the history of Islamic State and then leave a question for discussion and a starting point for next sessions. So without further ado, let's get started. So this is the flag of Islamic State as we can see it on television. But how did this come about? Why did this happen, and where does history start? Well, that's very arbitrary. We could go back all the way to the start of Islam and look there. But I chose to start a little bit earlier. And that is in 2000. The year 2000 is when Zarqawi emerges. Zarqawi is a Jordanian, and he moved to Afghanistan. He moved to Afghanistan to lead a terrorist organization, and he became very infamous there. He was responsible for many attacks. And then he moved to Iraq because he was wounded in Afghanistan. He moved to Iraq, to Baghdad, and there he gathered a lot of followers around him in a relatively short period. So in 2000 he starts the Tawhid al-Jihad. It is being united, and jihad is a holy war. So united in holy war, and he started to operate this al-Jihad. Now, why is he important? Because later on, in 2004, he unites with Bin Laden, and he becomes the head of the Al-Qaeda operation in Iraq. So please don't hesitate to stop me and say, okay, I cannot follow, and we have an opportunity to do a brief recap in Japanese perhaps. Okay, so in the period 2003-2004, United States, George Bush declares war on Iraq because there was evidence of weapons of mass destruction. But later on this evidence didn't seem to be as solid as was implied by George Bush at the time, but the time was ripe. The 9/11 attacks had occurred in 2001, and everybody wanted to do something. I happened to be in United States at 9/11, and I really felt that immediately after the attacks there was kind of apathy in the United States. Nobody knew exactly how to respond. In Japan, in the Netherlands, there was a big outrage, but in the United States itself, in New York, people were too much in shock that they didn't know what to do, including President Bush. He didn't really know what to do. He went off the radar for 2 days, and then he came and he made this speech that we're going to fight back, and that was exactly what the Americans needed. And that sentiment actually grew and grew, and that led to the attack in Iraq. This is a picture of Saddam Hussein after he was captured, and he has some investigation here. So the United States attacks Iraq and solves an immediate problem, but a bigger problem starts to occur because there was not really a plan what to do after the attack. So this is al-Zarqawi. He forms the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I already touched upon that. So in 2006, al-Zarqawi became more and more of a nuisance to the United States, and Jordanian authorities, in combination with the United States, tried for the Iraq authorities to extradite Zarqawi. They gave them very clear signals on where Zarqawi was and how they could catch him, because they had actually captured some of his people. So they knew exactly where he was, but the Iraq authorities did not do anything about it. So they didn't catch him. So at last, the United States launched an attack with a 230-pound bomb they dropped on his compound, and he was killed in 2007. After that, Al-Qaeda power is diminishing. So in 2006, this is a picture of 2006. This is where Al-Qaeda has influence, very strong influence in Mosul, the second city in Iraq, but also in Baghdad, Fallujah, Samarra, names that we still hear in the news every day. So in 2006, there was still a very strong presence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were very well represented. But in 2008 already, you can see after al-Zarqawi disappears that Al-Qaeda's influence is reduced. And one of the reasons behind it is that the Sunni tribesmen, the Sunni tribes leader who are present in this area, are being paid by the Americans. They receive money to actually stand up against Al-Qaeda and fight them. So they receive money to do this. So there is gradually a power vacuum starting to occur.
Oh, excuse me. Could you say again the name of the representative in Iraq?
Al-Zarqawi.
So supported by U.S.
Yes.
Someone supported by U.S. The name of the people.
Oh, sorry, that's the Iraqi tribesmen. So Iraq, actually, it is a country, but it basically consists of a number of tribes. And one of the reasons why there is so much opposition about the influence of the West is that Iraq, as a country, was an invention from Western powers. It wasn't a country before World War I. It was a group of tribes that coexisted, that shared religion, but not always, because there are different religions living together. I will show a slide later. But these tribesmen still form a very strong power base, a local power base. So if you can get them on your side, you can win. You can get a lot of influence, and that is happening now also in the fighting the IS.
Excuse me. Before they receive money from US, do they receive anything from Al-Qaeda group?
Yes. So actually, this is the Al-Qaeda group. So the red spots on the map here is Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda was actually they were losing influence in the area after al-Zarqawi died, because inflow of money was lessened, opposition from the local people increased. So basically that's why Al-Qaeda was starting to lose influence.
By the way, when
That guy?
killed
al-Zarqawi, 2006.
Saddam Hussein, when Saddam Hussein killed?
Saddam Hussein was
At that time, 2006 or 8 or around that?
just before that.
Before that?
Before
so it
that.
means already Prime Minister was Maliki, right? Maliki.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So this is also, and now we're going off in a tangent because it's a little bit difficult to keep the main line here, because there are so many interconnected stories. Maliki is actually is a
Shia.
It's a Shia Muslim. Yeah. So that we tend to think, if we look at it from a very far distance, that Muslims are all the same, but they are not all the same. Actually, there are two main streams, and there are actually a lot of sub streams within the Muslim religion.
So Al-Qaeda is Sunni.
Al Qaeda is Sunni. Sunni is the majority religion, but the majority of people in Iraq is actually Shia. So Iraq has been dominated by Saddam Hussein, who was Sunni.
So opposition party of the Maliki government moved into the Al Qaeda.
Yes, but a lot of those tribe leaders in this area are also Sunni. So they took an economic decision, and they were fed up of Al Qaeda, because Al Qaeda was not winning this. That wasn't going anywhere, and the fact that the United States gave them money helped basically to reduce the influence of Al Qaeda, and eventually fueled the invasion of IS. So now there is a lot of information on this slide. I think we can focus on some of the main themes here. This is the Arab Spring timeline. This is what's happening. Very significant events that were occurring in the Arab Spring. And it started in 2010 in Tunisia, where a vendor sets himself on fire, a protest against the treatment by the police. Tunisia, if you visit the country, it's if you would have visited the country before, it was suppressed, but not so much suppressed as in other countries like Syria, for example. But Tunisia was somehow the starting point. It immediately resulted in protests all throughout the Islamic world. One of the reasons was that a lot of these countries were former colonies. And colonial powers had the habit of siding with minorities, giving power to minorities to help them to exercise the power. If you need to maintain good relationship with the majority, you need to invest much more money. So siding with minorities is usually the most cost-effective way to keep control. So many of these countries were ruled by minorities. And the people, the majority, which is actually the Sunni group within the Muslim world, they started to rise against their governments. So everything was in flux between 2010 and well, basically still today. If we look at Syria, for example, if we look at Yemen, that also recently started to overthrow. So the Middle East became very unstable. And the most important things that we need to focus on here is Syria, where the civil war started. The people rose against Bashar al-Assad, and Iraq was also important. But the things start here in Syria. This is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He is the leader of the IS. He initially started his activities in Syria. And IS was supported and widely funded by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia provided them with lots of cash. And they and also the United States provided them with weapons and training, because they were the hope to overthrow Assad, the president of Syria. But things got out of hand quickly. So al-Baghdadi has a bloodline, and basically the agenda of Baghdadi was not to overthrow Assad. That was not his main purpose. The main purpose was to establish a caliphate. And a caliphate is something like a state. The state lines in the Middle East are drawn up by Western powers. But before that, in the beginning of Islam, there was a caliphate. A caliphate was a country, a state where religions could coexist. And a caliphate was something of a state for Sunni Muslims, where Sunni Muslims united. So they wanted to ignore the existing country borders and start this caliphate in Jordan and in Iraq. So this is Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot was drawn up. Sykes and Picot were two politicians from England and France. And Sykes-Picot, they came up with a division of the Middle East, basically a division after World War I. Before World War I, there was the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. And the Turkish Empire had been ruling for 400 years, a very long time. And within the Turkish Empire, there was this caliphate. But finally, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. They sided with Germany and Italy in World War I. They lost. And France and England decided that it was time to divide the Middle East in order, and in a deliberate action, most likely, deliberate action to create division, to not create stable states. Because if you look at, for example, how these countries were drawn up, we see that a line was drawn in the middle of Sunni, in a Sunni area. And Iraq now has Shia and Sunni, and the same goes here for Jordan. And we have the what's their name? The Kurdish group that has a big influence here. So these country lines were drawn up to create division among the Muslims, and this is where a lot of the protest, a lot of the hatred comes from. So IS wants to restore the situation as it was before the Sykes-Picot Treaty. They say, okay, this is actually keeping us divided. We need to unite as Muslims, and that's the idea behind the Islamic State. So, in the beginning, there was the Nusra Front when it was still ISIS. There were activities in two countries. The Nusra Front was that started as a rebellion against Assad, President Assad, and Baghdadi was involved here. And then in 2012, 2013, United States started to retreat from the United States. We already saw a lessening influence of Al-Qaeda, and IS basically started to was initially part of Al-Qaeda, and they started to split off. Al-Qaeda did not agree with IS and their ways, because they were too cruel, they were too oppressive to the people that they dominated, and like even if you're ousted from Al-Qaeda, you're very, very radical. So the power vacuum started to occur. There is no stable regime in Iraq. The Shia majority, who has been elected, do not include the Sunni minority. So in this area, the tribesmen who initially ousted Al-Qaeda basically invited IS in, because they were fellow Sunnis. So it was very easy for them to take control of Iraq, because the government did not have the support of the tribesmen. So you can see very quickly IS gained influence. And they had lots of funding from outside. They had $2 billion at their disposal. There were many people from Western countries, from North African countries, where there was unrest, who came to join IS, to join the establishment of the caliphate. And nowadays there are fighters from all over Europe, from North Africa. The biggest group is, and probably not by chance, from Tunisia, where the Arabic Spring started. And they're all fighting under this flag. So this is what happened afterwards. And as you can see now, that IS has taken control of a very, very significant part of Syria, as well as Iraq, very close to Baghdad, very close to where the government sits. They've taken Mosul, Tikrit, Fallujah, so they really expanded very, very quickly. And the question is whether they can expand their influence or not. This is in January 2015, and we all remember these images. Jihad John on this video, who is threatening to kill Japanese hostages, and eventually follows up on that threat. Both Japanese hostages are being killed, causing for a major outrage not only in Japan but throughout the world. So IS is not trying to create any friends, not trying to create any bonds, any alliances. Even Saudi Arabia has withdrawn their funds. Nowadays, IS is gaining money by extorting the local people, by taking over oil plants, selling the oil illegally. It is implied that it's sold to, for example, through Turkey and through other routes. So IS is basically trying, is isolating itself from the world and is keeping this war going. Now this is something that we can talk an hour about, but it's just to illustrate you how complicated things are, how many relations there are in the Middle East, and how we cannot see this in isolation of the things that are happening around here. So we have the Islamic State in the middle, but we also have two sovereign nations, Syria, Iraq. We have the Kurdistan regional government. And we should definitely not forget about Iran, who are taking a very significant role here. Iran is at the other side of the equation. Iran is a Shia state, a Shia-dominated state, and Iran is now heavily involved in fighting IS. They are not only fighting IS at their own site in Iraq, but they're also fighting IS through subsidies at Hezbollah, who are located in Lebanon. So there are two fronts supported by Iran that are fighting IS, which is good news, you would say. But it's also bad news, because now the tribesmen who are fed up with IS in itself, because they are too cruel, they are being extorted, they are also being used, they are also afraid to turn away and look for support from the Iranians, because they are basically they belong to a different group. So who can they trust? They cannot trust anybody. So there is this constant state of unrest. Now we have the situation in Yemen, we have Libya, and these are all places where a lot of these extreme terrorists are being trained and are being used to fight and are providing constant blood to this conflict. So the situation is very complex, and way too complex to discuss in a breakfast session. So what is the future? What is the future? Well, the future, I think, for IS is very grim. I don't think that the IS has a very long future ahead of them. Why? Number one, because the IS is basically a group of soldiers from all different parts of the world, and there is actually very little internal cohesion. For example, the fighters who came from Europe are treated as second-rank fighters. They're not taken seriously, and a lot of these fighters are actually second-generation Muslims. They're not first-generation Muslims. They're second-generation Muslims. Their fathers and grandfathers came to Europe, and they grew up in a Western society that did not really accept them, that did not really embrace them, that did not really treat them as equals. So they started to turn against and started to look for their roots. but they were not really. They actually never grew up in this area, so they had completely different values and different ideas from the fellow fighters who were born and raised in this area. So there is a big cultural gap between the fighters and among themselves.
Those soldiers speak the Arab language?
Not all of them speak the Arab language. A lot of them speak a little bit. Sometimes you see those videos where, for example, for the international audience, they have some people. They are quite well organized, actually. So there are some people who are responsible for PR, so public relations. So they appear in these videos. And you can tell by the way that they are expressing themselves. After every sentence they put inshallah, for example. Well, this is really basic. This is what I would say if I would visit there. This is if you don't know any Arabic, you use that constantly.
Like this John.
Yes, like this John. Yes.
I didn't recognize what is their common language, English?
So this is this is actually part of the problem. Not everybody is on the same page in terms of communication.
But many
They do not all
people
understand each
speak
other.
Arabic, right?
Yeah, well,
this is Islam. Islam, they will study Arabic. So I didn't realize what's the common language they speak.
So-
English? I don't think so.
no. Well, if you go, for example, to the Netherlands, where I'm from, there are many people from the second generation. They learn the basics of the language at home, so they still speak Arabic at home. So a lot of Arabic is spoken, but on a very, very low level. And I'm quite certain from the videos that I saw that not all of them understand completely what's going on. So they're
30,000 soldiers came from outside those areas. So those people might not speak Arabic. So I can guess they can communication tool might be English. Only way they try to communicate, not Arabic. Right?
But actually, I've been in Jordan and Syria.
You went there?
Yeah, and they don't. English is not very widely spoken.
What
So
is-
Kurds, for example, are much better at speaking English than.
how they try to communicate each other?
So they must use, like, the chain of command is very vertical, right?
Yeah.
So what's probably happening is that the main language is Arabic, and that's also one of the reasons why so many operatives from Europe are in the lower echelons, because they cannot really communicate very well with other rulers.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
So internal cohesion is very loose. Then the near enemy approach, and this is something that Al Qaeda did a little bit different from IS. But IS is basically, they are concerned with only their own territory. They don't have a bigger agenda, and this is how they lose support from the outside world. And so they are fighting basically among themselves. They're fighting against other Muslims. They're trying to uphold their territory that they conquered, the caliphate. But they don't have a bigger picture. They don't really do anything against Israel. They don't really do anything against the United States. Only in their nearest presence. Now this is something that doesn't make a lot of friends in the Islamic world. Obviously, you need to have a far enemy approach if you want to include the people around you. If you want to get support from people around you. So the near enemy approach is probably something that will keep them isolated if they don't change that. They have some very powerful enemies at the moment.
What do you mean near enemy?
Near enemy is that you are basically fighting your own people. They're all Muslims. They're fighting in Iraq. They're fighting in Syria. They're fighting Muslims. And Al Qaeda was fighting the U.S. Al Qaeda was fighting Israel.
Oh, I see. So they just only the conflict and battle among their races or religion.
Yes.
Sunni and Shia sort of.
Yes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Yeah, so they are not making any friends. They keep on isolated. They have very powerful enemies. They used to have support from Saudi Arabia, from the United States. They are now enemies, and they are supporting the local operations with airstrikes. They are supporting the people around that. For example, the Kurds take a very important role. The Iranians are taking an important role, and the local tribesmen are also more and more fed up with IS. So there is a constant pressure on IS to keep on fighting. And if you keep on fighting, you cannot develop anything. So how can you develop a state if you're in constant state of war? Eventually, the way I see it, this can only implode. But the question is, what's next? And the question is, what does it mean for Japan? In which period will this finally fall apart? And what will happen to all the people who have been going to war, who are trained to use weapons, who have a terrorist agenda, within the next 4, 5, 6 years? Think about the Olympics. Think about things that are happening. So with that thought, I would like to hand over to Sasaki-san. To maybe.
Just a moment, you had better ask question to the audience.
Oh yeah, but so maybe you want to explain something in Japanese. Chigao? Would you like to have some questions in Japanese, or can we continue in English?
まあ一応今ので全部用意したスライドの説明は以上だけれども、もうちょっと分かりにくいところ、特にサイクス機構のところとかはちょっと世界史とか勉強されてない方はちょっともしかしたら分かりづらかったかなと。ちょっと解説もあんまり書いてなかったので、もしそういうところ必要であればいただければ。Please explain more detail
about Sykes people? Yeah. So,
Are you familiar with?
I deliberately, I'm familiar with the Sykes people to some extent. I deliberately took many steps because this is an opening meeting and we need to get some kind of idea of the bigger picture. So from here, we can take side steps towards Sykes-Picot, towards the division in Islam, the role of Islam, for example, in Asia. So since we are starting to create a series, trying to create a good opening. So I took many big steps that we can fill in later. But let's go back to Sykes-Picot. So the way. And now I have to be careful not to make an even bigger picture. So it all started with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was an empire ruled by the Turks, and it was a very large empire from Turkey through this part of the Middle East to the Arabic Peninsula and throughout North Africa. Very impressive if you realize that those people didn't have the communication means that we have today. So it must have been very difficult to maintain this. And one way how they managed to maintain this is to give autonomy to people to actually engage in their own religion. So for example, Christians and Shia Muslims and all kinds of sects could peacefully coexist with each other within the Ottoman Empire. It is not true that there was no discrimination, for example, but they had some kind of local autonomy. They could even leverage their own taxes among themselves. So the Ottoman Empire was basically some kind of a how to say it? Maybe we can compare it to the European Union today. So a group of different tribes and people with different religious backgrounds that peacefully coexisted. The Ottoman Empire reached their peak probably around 1600. So that's and then there was a very long period of decline. They had some brief surges in their power, and they frequently challenged Europe But eventually they went one bridge too far. The Ottoman Empire was really diminishing. It was not much more than Turkey. And they decided to join Germany, decided with Germany in World War I. And World War I was lost. And after World War I, and perhaps you know this, the Allied forces made a very big mistake after World War I to ask too many compensations. They took too much influence. So they took the attitude of winner takes it all. And this led to asking very high compensations from Germany. But also dividing the Middle East, because oil was becoming more and more important. They needed access to oil. And so, for example, the situation in Iran, probably you know this, there was the Shah of Iran, the Shah of Persia. And the English put the Shah in power. So the king in power, while basically people didn't feel very much allegiance to the Shah. The Shah was more or less a puppet of the British regime. But the Shah gave the British direct access to oil. So they could exploit oil. So for them, for the British, it was a very good deal, and the Shah could remain in power. So Iran, as we all know, eventually was overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini and became a non-secular state. They also used their influence after the war to really divide up the states, and this is still, there's still a lot of criticism. We during one of our sessions, I remember we saw a video from Erdogan, the former president, currently prime minister of Turkey, who made a speech about the hiccups of Churchill, Winston Churchill. So there are some very strange border lines here drawn up by Churchill, and who was behind the Sykes-Picot treatment. So it was implied by Erdogan that Churchill must have been drunk at the time he was drawing up these border lines. But he was not so drunk as to get the basic idea is to keep the Middle East unstable. So we can, with very little effort, if they are fighting among themselves, they're not fighting with us. So we draw these border lines in order to make sure that they will be very busy fighting for power among themselves. And while they are fighting, we have access to oil. We can control the Middle East very easily. So Sykes-Picot became, under the Sykes-Picot Treaty, countries like Jordan and Syria and Iraq came into existence. They never existed before World War I. But they came into existence. And some people benefited and others did not. So for example, in Iraq, there was a Sunni government, the Ba'ath Party from Saddam Hussein. The Ba'ath Party was actually a minority party. It was not the majority. In Syria, the same situation. The Assad regime was actually a Shia regime, but the majority of the people in Syria has a Sunni religion. So the minority was ruling the majority in all these cases. So you can see the unstable situation that started to occur, and the risks of a total civil war when the Arab Spring started to come into existence. So Sykes-Picot became a symbol of the abuse, of the evil intentions of Western powers with the Middle East, and that became one of the symbols that could unite the Arab world if they were to give up their distrust among themselves. But that so far has been impossible.